Malaysia has increased its expenditure under its 9th Malaysia Plan by 30 billion ringgit. This is to ensure a sustainable economic growth of 6% from 2008 to 2010. Prime Minister Abdullah Badawi tabled the midterm review of the 9th Malaysia Plan, or 9MP, in Parliament on Thursday. How far have the goals of the 9MP been achieved? Get the insights in Inside Malaysia this week. I'm Saiful Bar Ismail. The 30 billion ringgit extra allocation in the midterm review of the 9MP will focus mainly on financing priority projects such as the Food Security Programme, construction of rural roads and provision of low-cost housing. Mr. Abdullah emphasized that the review was important to ensure continuous development, especially in the light of the current challenging economic situation. Some of the accomplishments during the first 2 years of implementation of the 9th Plan, as highlighted by Mr. Abdullah, is the reduced poverty rate from 5.7% in 2004 to 3.5% in 2007. The 9th Malaysia Plan is a 5-year comprehensive economic blueprint that was launched in March 2006. At the beginning, a lot of optimism was generated when the Prime Minister introduced various economic corridors throughout the country. The 9th Malaysia Plan was unveiled at a time when the country was starting to recover from the Asian financial crisis and challenging economic landscape as a result of high oil prices. The external environment has not improved since then. In fact, it became worse as palm prices continued to soar, reaching almost $140 a barrel now. Tricia Yeo, Director, Centre for Public and Policy Studies in Kuala Lumpur, examines the impact of the plan on certain sectors of the economy 2 years after it was started.
Some of the things which deteriorated in the past 2 years or so of its implementation was, for example, the growth rate of manufacturing sector was significantly reduced between 2006 and 2007, when previously manufacturing was one of the largest contributors to our country's GDP. Our export growth rate has also slowed down slightly between 2006 and 2007. Granted, the forecast for 2008 is slightly better, but the year's not over yet, so it's difficult to say.
Besides external factors, what transpired domestically also affected the goals of the 9th Malaysia Plan. It is clear that the results of the March elections, which chipped the power of the federal government, have disrupted the implementation of the economic blueprint. Essentially, under the plan, Kuala Lumpur will allocate funds to the various states to carry out development projects. However, with 5 states now under the control of the opposition, it is uncertain how far the economic corridors in these states will be pursued. Already, the government is putting on hold a 1.5 billion ringgit road project and a 2 billion ringgit monorail project in Penang. According to Tricia Yeo,
so it's really been a testing time between the federal and state relations, and very much a first for Malaysia. So, for example, where in the past one of the objectives lined up was to implement the Northern Corridor together with many of the developmental corridors, and now with Penang and Perak being governed by the Pakatan Rakyat parties, it's been slightly less clear as to how the funds are going to be distributed and whether or not the projects there will take off at all, really.
Whether or not the projects will take off, it will be good if the new opposition-held wards could learn how to govern with limited resources from the northern state of Kelantan. Although Kelantan lacks large federal funds for its development programs, it has continuously been able to sustain its grip on power for nearly 20 years. Dr. Ahmad Fauzi Abdul Hamid is a political analyst from University Science Malaysia in Penang.
I wouldn't think that the Selangor and Perak or Penang governments would have any difficulty. These 3 states, being industrial and economically more developed than Kelantan, they shouldn't have any major difficulty in actually withstanding pressure from the federal government. The federal government also has to realize that by applying pressure on these governments, they are actually eliciting more anger from the people actually.
To assuage public anger, Prime Minister Abdullah is planning to pull back expenditure on major projects, which may be perceived as unnecessary spending by the government in difficult economic times. But Dr. Dennis Hu, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies or ISIS in Singapore, thinks that Malaysia cannot afford to scale down its development plans.
The major setback in terms of development plans, of course, as you know, we're in the middle of the 9 Malaysian plan, which includes, of course, developing all these economic corridors, the Iskandar Development Region, the northern region as well. So if part of these funds are now being allocated for increased subsidies on fuel and food, then of course a lot of these projects will be delayed. I think this is a little worrying because, as you know, there's a big concern that we're losing our economic competitiveness to countries like China and also India. Many of these projects are meant to enhance our economic competitiveness, you see.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to Inside Malaysia on Radio Singapore International. This week, we are looking at the midterm review of the 9th Malaysia Plan. How far has it been able to achieve its goals halfway through the implementation period? Even though the federal government may have to scale down some of the big projects that it has promised, Dr. Ahmad Fauzi reminded that the plan is not just about material development. He explains.
For instance, in his speech inaugurating the RMK9 in 2006, Prime Minister mentioned about the first-class mentality. For instance, more liberal freedoms, freedoms of the press, freedom of organization. But some of the promises which were made by the government in 2004, even after 4 years, they had not been implemented. For instance, judicial reform. But only after the government was humiliated during the last elections, then there was an action to actually implement these reforms. Therefore, the sincerity of the government here can be questioned.
Moving forward, what are some of the things that can be improved to help make the plan a success? Tricia Yeo, Director, Center for Public and Policy Studies, shares her thoughts.
The bodies that are tasked with the implementation of developmental plans, the question is whether there is independent monitoring of these implementation processes, independent monitoring of the bodies as well. So one of the proposals that came up during our midterm review discussion was whether we could actually have a more independent economic planning unit to ensure that the strategic direction is set independently from the sort of political rhetoric that we see very much emerging from within the ruling coalition.
Even though the ruling Barisan Nasional coalition has been forced to concede some of its power, it still runs the federal government. However, de facto leader of the Pakatan Rakyat, Anwar Ibrahim, had repeatedly said that the opposition will form the next government by September this year. But how able is the opposition if they run the country to formulate an economic blueprint like the 9th Malaysia Plan? Dr. Ahmad Fauzi from University Science Malaysia with this view.
If they are serious in actually wanting to capture or take over the government by September 2008, for instance, they have no choice but to come up with a blueprint, an economically sustainable blueprint and convincing blueprint, not only to the rich but also to the poor, not only to Malays but also to non-Malays. Because the Pakatan Rakyat is proud of the fact that they would represent Malaysians, not merely Malaysians of a certain class or a certain race, but Malaysians of all color, creed, religion, ethnicity, and so on. But of course, at the national level, this has yet to be proven.
To what extent will the new measures in the midterm review help attain the objectives of the 9th Malaysia Plan by 2010? There are still 2 years to go for the plan's implementation. This period is possibly too short to have any major impact on the current blueprint, which has been largely upset by changes in the country's political landscape. The 9th Malaysia Plan is the foundation for all the economic corridors which carries with it much potential. The people still wait to reap its benefits. That ends Inside Malaysia this week. I'm Saiful Bahari Ismail for Radio Singapore International.